All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce Manav. He's a third-year PhD student in CS at Purdue, working with Ankit Bera, and he's also a member of the Ideas Lab. He got his undergraduate degrees in CS and math at UMass Amherst, and I know him through our work at Amazon. I'm his mentor as an applied science intern there. We've been working on deep representation learning for scene understanding with downstream tasks for robotic stow. And his PhD work is primarily on something not unrelated, so interpretable scene understanding and representation for a broad variety of robotics applications, but one of the focuses is human-robot co-adaptation and collaboration. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Lillian, for the introduction, and it's nice being here. Thank you for inviting me and kind of hosting this talk. I've binged a lot of these talks kind of in the past when I found them on YouTube, so it's kind of nice to be here talking. And also, you have a very beautiful campus. I like being in like a city campus. Both my undergrad and now grad school is in like a very kind of remote like college town. There's nothing to do around, so this is kind of nice to see what I've been missing. But yeah. So this talk is mostly going to be comprised of my work over the last year, or maybe even more than that now. But along the way, I'll kind of pepper in some of the other projects that I've worked on that happen to be kind of relevant. I'll kind of end it more going into the work that I was doing before I was pulled away to Amazon to work on the interesting things happening there. But yeah, we won't really be going into the Amazon stuff that much. But yeah, so interpretability, right? The broader work I'm interested in is kind of agents that can explain their actions. Though this talk will be mostly focused on interpretability, which is not maybe as strong. So with the expectation that maybe robotic agents won't be able to explain exactly what they're trying to do, but through their actions, you'll be able to maybe infer what they want to do, what they are doing, and kind of their belief process and their understanding of the world as they're going through this. Really, we're kind of focusing on trying to understand the actions, goals, intents, and beliefs of these robotic agents as they're kind of doing the tasks that they are doing. The kind of title for this talk is concept learning for interpretable and efficient robotic agents. And what we'll kind of see is when we focus on the interpretability aspects, we get a lot of efficiency for free in the way that we formulate things and as like a consequence of the way that we're doing things. But yeah, a definition that I kind of like is from like Tim Miller, which is interpretable robotics is the degree to which humans can understand the cause of decision that like a robotic agent makes, and that's fairly applicable. So why do we need interpretability, right? Machine learning models are awesome, and like a big contributor to like the recent boom in robotics that we're seeing, and robots are like more capable now than ever and fairly adaptive, more adaptive than they've ever been really. But machine learning models make mistakes, and oftentimes it's not particularly easy to see why they're doing what they're doing. This isn't really as big a deal when you're kind of working with that in isolation, right? If your project is just like the MNIST data set, you're predicting like what digit it is, it's not really as big a deal. But when you're kind of deploying it on like an actual learned robot, then there's more of a complication, right? Things can go wrong. So like here we have like a bunch of different kind of robots that maybe you've seen around. I was down in Austin for a bit, like a few weeks ago, and we have like these Waymo cars kind of just peppering the street. They do interesting things. It's still kind of odd to see them driving like without a driver for me, but it's still quite cool. But yeah, kind of more simply, like the simplest example, right? We have like the Roomba robots. They're cleaning whatever room that they're in, but if it kind of accidentally bumps into you, it's not really that big a deal, right? Same with kind of the grocery robots with like the odd googly eyes. If they bump into like a stall, they knock some like kind of produce off onto the floor. It's not that big a deal. Someone's gonna kind of clean it up. There's not really that much damage done. But in the situations that we see on the right, where we have like autonomous cars kind of operating in real streets, or we have kind of like more of like a military context where we have robotic agents that are like working side by side with like people that are deployed in the field, or we have kind of the application further below where we're trying to now more and more incorporate robots in the workforce, right? Where let's say you have some kind of warehouse and you want to work more collaboratively with a robot rather than it kind of just working on its own with like whatever safeguards it has. In these contexts, it's really beneficial to be able to tell what a robot is doing, why it is doing whatever it's doing, kind of what's the reasoning behind it. And you can kind of see why that would be useful. Like particularly like the military aspect, right? These are fairly high stress situations where you don't necessarily always have time to, let's say the robot's doing something weird or odd that you don't quite understand. That's extra brain power or manpower that you're now trying to put into understanding why it is kind of malfunctioning that you could be kind of putting towards like staying alive and actually working on like your safety critical goal and so on. Yes?
I guess we don't usually understand, or we don't always understand why humans make decisions, right? Or even when I ask you why you make a decision, you might tell me something that it doesn't really explain the motivation. So there's explanations and causes, and they may not be the same, right? Yeah. And so like, why is it different for a robot system from a human system?
I think when we talk more about, I guess, beliefs and explanations, yes, there can be some kind of mismatch, but oftentimes in my experience, the gap is much larger when you're talking about like robots versus when you're talking about like humans. So I guess one thing that we've kind of seen is like hallucination, right? When you're talking to like GPT or something, it can give you an answer, but it doesn't necessarily kind of mesh with the answer that you would expect, or kind of is the actual reasoning for why it's doing something.
But for humans, that would be deception, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it exists in both systems in a way, right?
Yeah.
So is there something fundamentally different about the human interpretability question versus the robot interpretability question? Or are they kind of the same?
I guess in the context that you mentioned, where we have like deception, right? In different scenarios, like the military context, right? You would expect a human to kind of be on your side and like try to do its best to kind of operate with like the team goals. Whereas if a robot does something, it's not entirely clear if it's trying to deceive you or if it's just not capable of being able to understand what it actually did, right? So I think that's like a nuance that's fairly important.
Humans are also like that, though.
Yeah.
They do silly things.
That's they don't get very far with that.
The designed system should satisfy certain criteria, right?
That's crazy to do.
Yeah.
But yeah, so interpretability is fairly difficult. We have this kind of trend that we've seen in like machine learning where as interpretability and kind of model performance appears to almost be like kind of inversely correlated, right? Where you can have fairly interpretable models where like something like simpler, like a decision tree, where you can very easily kind of trace through the different decisions that some kind of agent has made, and you can understand that fairly well, given that the nodes are fairly well designed. And even sometimes when the nodes aren't well designed, you can kind of just try to understand the concept or the reasoning behind each of the nodes and kind of why it got to where it got. And then kind of all on the very end, you have like completely black box models, right? Neural networks where you have some kind of input, you get some kind of output, but you don't really have much of an insight in why you really arrived at that, right? So this is really kind of a trade-off where we want to be developing models that are kind of more towards the top right of this continuum, where you have good interpretability, but you also have like, you're not really giving up on kind of model capacity, accuracy, the overall kind of model performance that you care about. So that's kind of what I think I'm working on and kind of where a lot of interest is these days. Yeah, this is, of course, like not the complete story, right? There's other considerations. So this is like an example of, I think, what's it called? Marble robots. Yeah, I think these were in like San Francisco. And these are like food delivery robots, right? And looks like looking at it, you can kind of tell it's like bulky. It takes up like a lot of the sidewalk. And something that San Francisco actually did was they kind of delegated them to like a little kind of area of the city that they're like allowed to be in, and they can't really go outside. So it doesn't really matter how interpretable these are if they're not like socially conscious or kind of a net positive to the city, they're kind of getting in the way too much, then that's an issue. So here's like some like interesting work from kind of my lab where you have like kind of social consciousness in robots where it's over here, it's like inferring like the different kind of groups, and it's doing its best to kind of go around the groups and not really kind of pile through like some of the existing groups. And something like this, like, yeah, it's not delivering food, but you can kind of see how this would be like more amenable to like in like a big bustling city where you have like a bunch of different people trying to get where they're going. Maybe, yeah.
Is the navigation there being done by the vision system that's putting the boxes up?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we just got the readout and then we overlaid it on the video. The video stream from the robot itself didn't really look nice. So yeah, over here, it kind of understood that, oh, there's not really a way for me to go around without like violating the constraints that I have. So let me try to be like more careful and like see if people kind of spread apart. If not, maybe I'll just kind of go through anyways. But it kind of does it as like a last, yes?
I mean, what happens humans, like, if we run, like, what will happen to the system then? Like,
If like people run?
Like, instead of walking, like, we're like running, I mean, what?
Oh, yeah. So, I guess two different things would happen. One, I guess it's hard to like stay together as a group when you run, so that'll definitely be a consideration. Maybe at some point, the group might just kind of fall apart, there might be more space, and then the robot's okay with that. But if not, the model is robust enough to where it's able to keep up with like higher speeds, and it'll just kind of go around or like try to be in a space where there's no people. Yeah.
I see, so it knows whether people are like running or walking and then
Oh yeah, exactly.
adjust
So,
it.
yeah, there's a sense of it's trying to predict like the trajectories for where the people are going, but more than just where the people are going, it's trying to estimate the group as a whole and then kind of follow that kind of estimation that it has. Yeah. But yeah, this is not, I guess, directly related to interpretability, but kind of there's other considerations, right? So yeah, the kind of getting to the crux of, I guess, this talk and kind of what I'm interested in is concept learning, right? So this is kind of what I'm working on to try and make systems more interpretable. And the idea behind this is that you want to give robots and humans like more of like a shared vocabulary for kind of for how they think and operate. I think this definition, I don't know where it's from, but it's like fairly common. You're trying to teach them to recognize and kind of generalize patterns from data and kind of use those concepts that it learns to make better decisions. The diagram below is like an example from a paper from Joshua Tannenbaum. And the analogy that he kind of gives is you have, let's say you're trying to understand the idea of a vehicle, right? The way that we would kind of think about it is, okay, I see wheels, I see some way to kind of control it, I see like the rest of a body, that's a vehicle. You can kind of go deeper into that and say, I see two wheels only, I see like kind of like a stick kind of body, I see like more of like a bike kind of design. This is a Segway, yeah? And kind of the two things that we're getting here is this is now more aligned with the way that humans think about the world, and also you maybe are being more sample efficient in the way that you kind of reason about different things. So like on the left here, you have the example where you have like a bunch of different data, which is kind of labeled or supervised in some way, and then you're training on that, and you get some kind of prediction, which is fairly aligned with the distribution that you see in your training data. But if you kind of are able to break down the thing that you see into like different concepts, then you may be able to even perform better on outer distribution data. So like over here, we have an example which is like fairly different from all the things that it's seen, but we still want it to be kind of recognized as a bike, right? So if you break it down, then yeah, this thing has a wheel, this thing has like a bike kind of way that you kind of motorize or accelerate and control, and maybe the stick thing doesn't really align that well anyways, but it's fairly close in the way that you would reason about these kinds of things. Yeah, here's an aside to talk about like another motivation for kind of interpretability that is a little relevant to like one of the projects that I've done before. This is like a fairly common example that you might have seen before, where you can have some kind of machine learning model that is trained to predict like animals, right? So this particular one, let's say it gives you like 57% confidence that it's a panda. That's not that good, but it's something, right? But then what you can do is you can kind of adversarially generate some kind of noise, and this noise is like imperceptible, would be imperceptible to like humans. So if I just add this kind of pixel noise to the image, this still looks like a panda to us, but to this particular model that's been trained, it now recognizes this image as a gibbon with like 99% confidence or something like that. And the idea here is if we were able to instead of going from like pixels directly to like a prediction, if we're able to instead have some kind of understanding of the concepts that we're seeing in this image, we might be able to maybe even perform better and be robust to this kind of like adversarial perturbations to the image, or attacks really. So like if we had something like similar to like the last time where we were seeing like different components of like a bike, here if we were able to see like maybe the snout, the kind of coloration of the panda and so on, maybe we'd be doing better. This kind of ties back to like another project that I did like a few years back, where we're trying to combat like deep fakes, but what we want to do is we want to allow like benign edits. Like sometimes you want to edit a picture, you kind of crop it in, or you download it from somewhere and it's like bad quality, or like it's kind of cropped in a little bit because of the way the website's coded or something. We want those to be allowed because there's nothing necessarily malicious going on, but we want to kind of disallow edits where it's clear that someone was up to something, right? So like in the second image, we have like someone's kind of faces cut out, or like over here, we have someone's kind of faces cropped in, or maybe this face is even kind of adversarially perturbed to make it look like it is this person in the original image for some reason. We want to be able to be robust to these. So kind of the approach that we did for this was instead of having the entire kind of pixel space as our consideration, what we do is we look at kind of what do we actually care about in this image, right? We want to make sure that there's nothing odd going on. So we care about really the people in the image. We want to make sure that they're still there. It kind of makes sense what things we're looking at. So what we do is we get like the different faces for the image, and we get like feature vectors associated with the faces, and we use then those to sign the image. And whenever we would kind of come across this image in the net, we can kind of we can look in the metadata and then compare the different things that we're seeing in the features for the new faces, and then we would be able to make a decision regarding whether or not any kind of malicious change has been made. So when we get like features for this face and features for this face, that seems like a malicious edit. We don't see this person in the image anymore, and we see that she's still kind of in bounds for the image, but she's not there, right? Versus if we had some kind of image where the new image is just kind of like a downsampled version, we would still be able to say that there's been nothing kind of malicious done here. And this is kind of really another like formulation for like a concept where you're trying to learn the concept of a face and then using that instead to see whether the image is still valid, as opposed to trying to compare like directly pixels with pixels. But yeah, anyways, yeah, and here kind of this is like another paper where instead of kind of specifying exactly that we care about faces, what we're saying is let's have just some kind of bottleneck in our model, and try to see what that bottleneck learns when we kind of restrict it, right? Does it learn like salient features? And something that they found was one of the features that's like fairly interesting is that it learns to recognize like heads or faces for the animals, and then uses that as a concept to then do later predictions and in like the downstream version of the model. And this they also found was like found to be much more kind of adversarially robust while also having a sense of interpretability, right? Yeah. But yeah, kind of coming more towards robotics. This is a robotics colloquium. This is kind of the main project that I was working on for the last year or so. And the problem statement that we have is we're talking about rearrangement planning, right? Where we have some kind of goal state that we are trying to get to, and we have like this target state that we see in front of us. So in this context, we have like a bunch of different blocks, and we want to kind of try to move the blocks around to get some kind of target state. And there's been prior work done on this. There's the left one here, I think this is done at NVIDIA, which is like 20 minutes from here, in the lab led by like your own Dieter Fox. But here, they're trying to do like a fairly similar thing where they're trying to move the different things that they see into like some kind of target configuration. I think particularly they're using optical flows and minimization to do it. And then kind of the other thing that's related to the work that I did is that of kind of construction. It might not be immediately obvious yet, but will be soon, where instead of just kind of rearranging the things that you see in like the 2D manifold of like your desk, you want to kind of pick things up, put them together, or like build some kind of more interesting structure, right? I think this paper here, I think it's from Google at like ICML. They have like some kind of abstraction of like the grippers. You're able to kind of just pick things up. You have like magnets on the ends that you're able to kind of stick them together and so on. Yeah. Kind of applications for this is fairly obvious, right? You can have some kind of like robot that's like going around in your room and moving things, and let's say you have like a cleaning robot, right? Your room's a mess. You want it to kind of gather up all the things, put them in like specific like locations, kind of just clean up generally. This is like a task that's fairly applicable to that. The other task, I guess, is you have like some kind of robot and you're trying to do like some kind of construction project, right? Maybe this can be something that's trying to put together like an IKEA shelf, or like it's trying to help with like some kind of construction that's like augmenting the human workforce or something. But yeah, makes sense. So the structures and target structures that we care about more look like this, right? They're not just like some things like spoon on a desk. There's like some kind of like dependencies in these structures. So we have these blocks, and we have made some kind of like Lego structure with them. So like if you look at the one over here, this red block depends on this orange block. This orange one depends on the red one below it. This red one depends on both the orange and the white block over here, which in turn depends on these two pillars, which is like a fairly highly dependent kind of interconnected structure that you need to be able to understand to be able to build this in a proper way. Kind of obviously, if I was to just try to put the red one first, it's not really going to work. And you can't really depend on the heuristic that, oh, maybe just I'll put the ones on the bottom layer first and then the top one, because you have different sizes for the object, and you'll just be coding kind of edge cases and edge cases on, and you won't really get anything for it. But yeah, so for the approach that we have is kind of similar to what we've seen before, where we're going to try to break down the structure that we see into its base components and try to understand the concept of a structure. So we have this kind of building here, and we understand that it's kind of made up of these blocks, and these blocks over here are going to be like our start configuration, and our target is to build this structure that we see. And the intuition that we have here is we're able to kind of just get features for the different objects that we see. And next, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to decode the structure here. So this is exactly kind of what we saw before, where we have now kind of constructed like a DAG for DAG for the structure that we care about when we're building an object like this. So in like a case like this, on the kind of very first layer, we have like a blue object, we have a green object, and we have like a white object, right? So over here, the end of the DAG, you see like this kind of white object, and the end of another end over here is the blue object, and then another end is the green object. So really, if you're able to decode this kind of structural graph for the scene that you care about, you will then be able to just do like a topological traversal for this, and you get the plan for free, right? Not only were you able to get interpretability in now the robot's understanding of what the structure looks like is fairly similar to something that I would be able to understand and kind of work with, but you're also able to kind of offload all of the planning steps that you would do with like any kind of typical like controller or like closed loop kind of system. You're now able to offload it to kind of the scene understanding and perception part. So exactly what I talked about here, where you're planning, you're kind of able to just offload. And another thing that we see here is this is like more of like it looks kind of simpler even, because we have like independent substructures, right? We have this, we can see my mouse. We have like this structure over here, which is like cylinder with like a cube on it, with like another kind of cuboid on it. Which is fairly independent from the other stuff over here, right? This is another independent substructure. This is one, and then this kind of mishmash is kind of on its own. Oh, and the reason that this image looks kind of weird is it's like a point cloud representation of what the robot sees when it gets the perception in like simulation. Yes.
Could you go one slide?
Sure. Yeah.
So for the second graph,
Yes.
like fully connected graph, is that predefined or is that captured by the image?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So more diving a little deeper into the implementation. What we have here is we have like a perception system which takes in like a RGBD kind of observations, and then from there we have like some kind of segmentation and stuff that happens to give us like a point cloud representation of the object. That's the objects in our scene that is also like segmented, and then from those segmentations we can then kind of construct this kind of thing, where for each like node that is really representing an object. And kind of internally what we're doing is we have like shape level features for each object, and we have like a positional encoding that's also encoding where it is in our scene.
I guess to do so, don't you have to have one color and the other color, and then so like your graph has to be essentially like bipartite kind of thing? Like you cannot have two colors that are next to each other. I feel like that would be very hard.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So the colors here are mostly just like a visual indicator. We don't actually care about the colors for the structure, at least in the way that we've formulated.
Like what I mean is like you said we care about RGB values and positional encoding as well.
Oh,
what happens like if I have red thing on top of red thing on top of red thing on top of red thing, then isn't it kind of hard, or I don't know?
Yeah, that would be a little hard. That should. I think in something that we've done to kind of simplify this is we have like a base set of primitives that we don't really stray away from. So if you see like a really long like red thing, it kind of knows on some level that that's not really a primitive that's possible in our kind of state space. But yeah, doing it with unknown objects, that would definitely be more of a challenge. And yeah, if it's kind of perfectly stacked, that's like a challenge. Yeah, but I think there's like different parts of the pipeline here where in some parts you don't really consider the colors as much. Okay, yeah, so here, another thing that you kind of get for free is that you can implement some kind of parallelization. It has given us this kind of predicted kind of dependency graph, which is a DAG. And we know that this substructure doesn't really depend on this because they're not connected in our space, right? So what you can do is you can also have like multiple different manipulators working on this at once, or kind of, since this is such an interpretable plan, with some safety constraints, you can also have just another human working on the same structure at the same time, right? So that's kind of another benefit that we get from the way that we're kind of offloading all our work onto the scene understanding part. Another thing is the fact that failure modes are fairly flexible here. So like, let's say we modified this predicted DAG, right? So this is what we see is true. But let's say, look at this structure, right? So this is, we've got a red on top of gray on top of a green, which is this structure here. Red on top of a gray on top of a green. And we have this structure here, which is blue, that's supported by one red, one green, and which is in turn supported by like these two objects for both of them, which is like this structure over here, right? So if we add this edge in our DAG, then what's the prediction really saying? It's saying that I can't build this part before I build this part. So that's what the robot is going to do. But the only thing that loses you is the parallelization. You still have to pick one object at a time and in our formulation. And so even if you have like some kind of over prediction, you're not really losing anything in terms of performance, which is like a neat part. So under the hood, the way that we're doing like these kind of predictions is we have like a graph, right? And then we formulated this as like a link prediction problem. And whenever we have some kind of get an output for some kind of probability distribution for the different links, and we might have some kind of threshold to decide what's a link and what's not. One failure mode that's interesting is if you get like if you get a cycle, right? I've been saying DAG all this time, but if you get a cycle, you can yeah, you failed, but you can kind of play around with the threshold to get like some kind of different prediction through the stochasticity of the network, where now maybe you don't have a cycle, maybe you have like more edges than you should really have, but you're not kind of stuck or failing at this point, which is interesting. To do this, something that I also kind of wanted to highlight was like the data. I think all of you have probably worked on projects where like collecting the data is like the first whatever number of months, and then the project comes fairly simply from that. But this is like an experience I had here where it ended up being like a fairly simple like heuristic, the way that I generate data, but it like works out really nicely. So the way that we do it is like we have some kind of primitives. We just kind of initially we put them randomly in our plane that we care about, and we have like some kind of allowable orientations for each of the objects. So let's say we have like the cylinder here, right? We're not allowing the cylinder to be on its side because that's a fairly unstable structure that we don't really care about, because it's going to roll away and the structure is going to collapse. So yeah, we have those allowable kind of orientations. We build the first layer, then after that we build the second layer, and particularly we're trying to maximize for kind of interdependent structures like this. So we're trying to place objects on as many kind of base objects as possible, and once we've done that, we've kind of exhausted like the pairs, we just put like single objects on to make it more interesting. And we can just kind of keep repeating this as many times as we want. And using like this fairly simple heuristic, we're able to get like quite a nice data set, which has like really rich information about the structure for the different buildings and objects that we see. And since this is like a kind of simulation data set, yes?
Does it physically make sense? Like, would that hold up? Like, if you put a block that has a certain weight, or like, would that fall over in the real life? Or like?
That's true. So this is all done in like Bullet. So it is like a physics environment we're trying to kind of simulate. So I think the way, more particularly the way that we generate it is we kind of drop it from like a certain height, and if it kind of stays stable, then that's like a stable structure. We've kind of mandated by the physics. And yeah, we have like friction coefficients. We've tried to kind of match the objects with like the ones that we have in real, so to kind of make sure that it kind of transfers well. And that's kind of also the reason that we're trying to use point clouds, because those generalize fairly well to like the real world with like some kind of noise. But yeah, we get fairly interesting structures. Here we have like a pyramid kind of thing. Again, like we don't want it to be on like its edge, so that's not really allowed. But we have like some kind of interesting like emergent structures here, which end up being like fairly useful when we're trying to train the classifier for for dependencies. Yeah, some kind of a little bit more details. So kind of the first step, of course, is like matching, right? We're trying to match objects from like an initial scene into like the final scene. And again, I've said the colors don't matter, but what does matter is kind of the orientation. We're trying to minimize the amount of change that you need to do to some object. So really what it's going to do is it's going to try to prioritize like this green block instead of kind of making it stand up straight and putting it here. It's going to try to understand, oh, maybe I can just kind of move it a little bit and then just like put it here with like a slightly different orientation. I think the way that we do it, like particularly in our implementation, is we get some kind of, we get like an orientation representation for everything in the initial scene. We get like an orientation representation or like a pose for all of the objects in the final scene, and then we try to do like a matching for the closest set, and then that's what the kind of algorithm follows after that when we try to get like this kind of directed acyclic graph. But yeah, the setup is like fairly similar to probably something that you've seen before, where you have some kind of object representation, where you have shape level features and positional features for everything that you have, and also orientation, and then you just kind of you encode the nodes, and then you have like some kind of decoder that tries to pairwise decode the nodes to say whether or not there's like a link there. And we've seen that it translates fairly well to real. Oh, I have to play all these myself. So again, if you see like a robot demonstration in like a paper or anywhere, just kind of be aware it's oftentimes sped up as it is here. But it works out fairly well. We have like I have to play it again. Okay. We have like the target image on the right here, and we're just sequentially kind of building it. I don't have videos here of like multiple manipulators working at it once, but it does work, and it gives you like a moderate kind of speed up, like maybe like 50% or so.
You mean two working together?
Yeah, exactly. So the other project that I want to talk about is one that I am working on now-ish, or was until kind of doing the interesting work here. And what we're trying to do here is trying to extend the idea of a concept to something that's maybe geometrically weaker, but maybe something like slightly more interesting for multi-agent systems, right? So let's say you have a bunch of different agents working in an environment, and you have some kind of prior, right? So looking at kind of this, we have red agents and we have yellow agents, and the behavior that we've kind of defined is yellow agents are afraid or like kind of move away from the red agents. And what we're trying to see is, can we use this behavior to complete interesting tasks, right? So something that comes to mind fairly quickly is like the herding behavior, right? You have this analogy where you have a bunch of different dogs and you have a bunch of different sheep, and kind of the classic farmer application is, can you get the dogs to work in a formulation over a series, kind of like a time series, to get sheep into like a pen or something, right? That's kind of the problem statement that we're working with. So applications for this are actually kind of interesting, which you would not quite expect. So one is like the classical one that I talked about. But I guess the example that I said is like a couple years outdated. Now, I didn't know this. Apparently what farmers do is they just have like giant helicopters, and they just herd cows around by like flying it really low and close to the ground. I think the article that I read said that like 12 people a year die from that or something, which sounds horrible, the helicopter crashes. It's a fairly dangerous thing to do, because I guess if you have the helicopter too far up, then cows are going to be like, okay, there's a helicopter, whatever. It's kind of loud. And you need to do like fairly swift maneuvers too, because it's like a fairly dynamic system, right? You have cows aren't going to be the most rational when there's like loud noise and like a giant machine blaring. Maybe it'll decide, maybe I should go off to this side and not towards the pen, and then you have to kind of wrangle that, and you have to do like fairly high-speed maneuvers and stuff. But that's the more kind of obvious application. The other applications are kind of, another thing that I saw was when you have like really small like nanorobots, right? You don't have the ability to actually kind of actuate them all at once, right? Because it's too small to have some kind of like steering mechanism inside. So something that you would do is you would have like another kind of slightly larger robot, and this one is going to be magnetic, or it's able to create some kind of repulsion between the kind of smaller ones that do the job and kind of the larger one that you have more control over. And now what you're trying to do is you're trying to target or control the larger ones so that they kind of herd the kind of useful nanorobots that are doing the actual work towards like the target centers that you care about, which is something that was quite unexpected to me, at least at first when I heard about it. But yeah, the other kind of applications like the classic military, you have like a bunch of different drones, you're trying to exert control over like a region of space, and you have like adversarial agents that have kind of their own beliefs and actions and things that they care about. And having like a good system of understanding how these agents kind of work together in a scene, or kind of what kind of control you can have over the other agents, is like a useful kind of strategic tool to have when you're working with things like this. Yeah. So next up, yeah, interestingly, there's been a good amount of work been done on this, but mostly only really from like the control theory side of it, where they have, so in this diagram over here, this is like a paper from, well, almost like 10 years ago now, but this was like the fairly foundational, I think, and kind of the main work that I saw done like at the very first kind of inception. But you have these kind of orange ones, which are kind of your herding robots, and then you have these dotted blue ones that are kind of the herdy robots that are being herded. And the person that worked on this kind of devised like some kind of control scheme where you kind of get them to converge on these kind of vectors, and then the kind of target vector is kind of that direction, right? But yeah, she has a lot of math and kind of really kind of rigorously proves that this works fairly well. Yeah, there's a fairly high repulsion here, yeah. Much higher than kind of the example that we saw here, right? Where you have like a bunch of these agents, and the agent, I guess, over here doesn't really care much about the agent over here. It only really ends up mattering when you go kind of closer here. But yeah, over here you kind of see the behavior where like three of the red ones kind of push like a bunch of the yellow ones over there, down there, which is kind of the behavior that we're trying to leverage, right? Yeah, there's like other work done here. I think this here is more of like an optimization approach. There's another paper that I saw recently which was trying to use like some kind of curriculum, like reinforcement learning to kind of get a similar kind of behavior. But there's still room here to kind of do interesting things with learning, I think. And that's what I'm working with. So yeah, the main challenge here is you have like, again, fairly complex like interdependencies between like different agents' actions. So whenever this agent moves, it's really changing kind of the repulsion field around everything else, and kind of gets everything else around it to move, and it really cascades from there, right? Yeah, there's collisions, there's different agents, like the yellow ones even kind of, apart from being repelled, they have like their own agency, right? When you're trying to model the system where you have like animals and stuff, they're not always exactly going to do so what you want them to do whenever you move in like a certain direction with your dog. So we're modeling that in like a fairly sane way, I think. Yeah, so our approach for this is, let's try to learn like a world model, right? This is a stronger thing to learn than just, I guess, concepts, right? But let's say that we have like some kind of forward model that we're trying to learn and some kind of inverse model that we're trying to learn. So we have states, which is kind of just, I guess, the state for the entire scene, where you have positions and velocities and so on, whatever nth time derivative that you care about for the different agents on the field. And you have accelerations, which are, well, not accelerations, but really actions that you can take for the robots that you control. So yeah, just some kind of notation, like here, the red ones are the robots that you can control directly. And let's say the yellow ones are kind of the passive agents that are gonna get herded, that you can't directly control. So your state space, your current state space, you have the position for everything really. You have the positions and kind of states for the red agents and the yellow agents, but the actions when you're the ones that you're controlling are only the red ones. So those are the only ones that it encompasses. And what we're trying to predict is not, let's say, the states for kind of all the agents that you have, but let's say just the states for the yellow agents, right? And kind of the inverse model for this is, again, you have the states for everything, and you have the next time step states for the yellow agents, and you're trying to predict what action must have the red ones taken to get to this time state, right? And if we have this kind of formulation, another thing that we see is, how visible is this? Yeah, fairly visible. Another thing that we see is we again kind of get planning for free, right? So let's say in the case that we were trying to herd all the agents to like some kind of goal state, and let's say we have like multiple different goal states, right? We have, let's say this is the current position of, all of these agents are just the agents that are being herded over time. So this kind of fading effect is, let's say, going into the future. So we're trying to get this agent to this goal. We're trying to get this agent to this goal. We're trying to get this agent to this goal. I'm not sure if you can see the outlines, but hopefully that helped. And really, if we have this kind of model, then what we can do for planning is just like a fairly simple linear interpolation. We can say this needs to go here. So at whatever next time step that I care about, it should be over here. At the next time step, it should be over here. After that, it should be over here, and so on, which is like a fairly simple thing to do. And your next target state, you can just use your inverse model and say that, oh, this is my target state where I want this agent here, this agent here, this agent here, and you can feed that as the next state that you care about, and then you'll get back the actions. And in practice, this ends up working out fairly well, at least in our preliminary results. Some details are that you don't necessarily have unique solutions for the inverse model. So let's say we have this example, right? So where, okay, here the lighter states are the past. So let's say you have some kind of equilibrium that we've reached where the red agents are equidistant from the yellow ones, and no one's moving because there's no kind of incentive. So the forces are being canceled out, so the yellow agent stays still. If the red agent moves to the left in the top example here, the yellow one's going to move here also, because now there's like a stronger force coming from here because it's like a inversely decaying like vector field, right? And if you're caring just about the states of the yellow agents, then a similar action gives you the same result, and which is that, let's say, the red agent moves to the left, which is going to have the same result as the yellow agent moves to the left, right? So we don't necessarily have unique solutions for the inverse model. And the one way that we get around that kind of is, let's say we have our inverse model that's taking in whatever state is that we're currently in, the next state, and it's giving us some kind of estimate of the actions. We're comparing that with like whatever data that we've generated. And another thing that we're doing in our loss function is, let's say whatever action that we got, let's also put that in our forward model and make sure that the state that we get from our predictive forward model is exactly the next state that we actually want. And when you train this, given the way that the forward model doesn't really depend on the inverse model, you can first kind of train the forward model to convergence, and then you can use the inverse model from there. We collect data in like a fairly interesting way, where we just kind of generate splines for everything, and then we have robot trajectories, and then for each episode, what we do is we just kind of have this kind of herdy kind of trajectories that's just like a reaction to the robot trajectories. And now we have fairly interesting like interaction data that we can train on. And yeah, there's like a bimodal behavior here, where whenever they're in the range is when this repulsion is happening, and then otherwise they kind of just do their own thing, which is some kind of given by some kind of uniform distribution or normal. But yeah, so kind of to end up a little bit, something I want to talk about is, so far we've been kind of directly defining the concepts that we care about, right? We directly define the idea that we have like structures that we care about. We directly define the idea that we want to have like a world model of everything that we're doing. More generally, let's say you have like some kind of scenario where you don't know what skills are useful, right? What do you want to do in that case? Here's like a fairly basic idea that we've been kind of working with, and this has been done in the past, but it's like an interesting idea, which is useful, is you want some kind of bottlenecking layer. So this is like your kind of typical neural network. You have some kind of inputs, you have whatever fully connected layers, and if we didn't have this kind of middle part, which is blue, it would be something fairly similar to what you've seen before, right? But now let's say we have some kind of bottlenecking layer. And this is like a fairly useful concept where you bottleneck the network, and now you're forcing the model to learn something that's useful and kind of an efficient use of the 3 nodes that it has here. It can't just learn like really kind of abstract or difficult to understand things, and it ends up being that these concepts are fairly interpretable most of the time. You can have more techniques here. You can kind of do this in like an unsupervised way. You can also have like a loss that regularizes to make sure that those concepts correspond to things that you care about, or you can kind of just let it happen and it ends up working out fairly well sometimes also. Another thing that people do is they try to impose like a distribution on the bottleneck. So that's particularly useful when you want the representations here to be kind of disentangled, right? You don't want the top node to learn the same thing as the bottom node because that's not particularly efficient. And one way to do that is just to make sure that you have, you're trying to learn a latent space that's more semantically consistent almost, more like dense as opposed to sparse, which imposing a distribution does fairly well. But yeah, that's really all that I wanted to talk about. Kind of some of the future work that I'm interested in is, yeah, I know this is like a fairly bare bones slide, but one thing is kind of language grounding, right? So let's say we have like all these LLMs here that have like this vast knowledge of like different concepts that it understands. So let's say you're working in like some kind of active information acquisition kind of area, right? Where you're trying to survey an area as fast as possible, as quick as possible. And can some kind of language understanding help you do that faster or in like a more interpretable way? So let's say I am in some kind of lecture hall, right? I see kind of the speaker kind of podium over here. I now know that behind this or in front of this, there must be seats. I know that behind here, there must be some kind of like presentation thing. If I'm doing the same for like a concert venue, I know there's like a green room, right? Can I use these things to do things in a more efficient way that are also like fairly understandable to like humans, right? Another thing is kind of modeling trust, and which is kind of more talking about, let's not have our optimization function just be, did we accomplish the task? Let's maybe add in like a term that maybe talks about, let's say I'm a robot and I'm working with a bunch of different humans. If I do something, how does that affect how much they trust me or how much I think they trust me? Can I also optimize for that alongside when I'm also kind of caring about my task? Does that actually help? But yeah, that's all I had. I'll give it to questions now.
Yeah, so if folks have questions, feel free to ask. Does anyone have a question? If not, I'll start with one. So like in the first part, well, I guess in both parts you talked about, you know, this concept learning, and in particular in the first part, well, I'm wondering about robustness. So in the first part, for example, you have these kind of generated block stacking things, and you said your physics, your engine kind of complies with physics. And there's some work from like 10 years ago by Tom Griffiths where like humans can look at blocks that are stacked up and know whether they're going to fall over or does it comply with physics. And I'm wondering, like, well, one, do your generated strategies always generate physically relevant like block orientation so they wouldn't fall? And if not, could you use human feedback to kind of understand how to like improve your model or make it more robust?
So this is the model to generate the structures? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was like more, I guess, nuance that I kind of skipped over, whereas like, let's say you have some kind of like object here, right? Where you have a smaller, stubbier object here and like a taller, thin one here. You can't just plop an object down, right? What we do is like we kind of fit like a plane to this and then try to place it on that. But yeah, there's...
So you're always generating physically, like not, like physically robust.
Yeah, so like most of the time we generate like physically robust things. Our kind of last check is just build the object, wait for some amount of simulated time. If it falls over, it's not really working well, and which happens actually for much more often than you would think. But to your last point, it is interesting to kind of look at building of different structures in the context of where you have like a human kind of helping you out. Maybe not for like maybe a data set generation, but let's say the task is like actually generating like a novel structure, right? Some kind of human feedback is definitely useful to kind of help ground the robot into like understanding what like an actual useful structure is. And I think a challenging part with that definitely would be how do you get the robot to learn like useful things from the feedback. So like a paper that I saw before was you can kind of correct the robot if you're kind of laxer on like collision constraints and stuff, but does it now learn that, oh, my hand should maybe be like this, which is the wrong feedback, versus my hand should be down lower, closer to the structure or something.
Okay, nice. So does anybody, yeah, go ahead.
Sort of that's follow-up question to
Yeah.
that question, but like learning some, I guess, segmentation or some features is like essentially learning a token for language models, right?
Yeah.
So how do we sort of generalize this so that, like, because one of the works that I saw was like one of the blocks, like you didn't actually rotate or anything. Like this block has to be this way, this block has to be straight, this block. So how do we make sure that these things are like rotationally invariant?
Oh yeah. I guess I didn't go into it too much, but it doesn't care. It is able to it doesn't care about the rotation from the initial and the final state. It is able to kind of reorient anything to the target state. The example, I guess, that I picked was fairly similar, but I think in the videos that you'll see, it does actually kind of rotate whenever it sees something. So like over here, let's see, right?
It was 2x, I couldn't really see.
Yeah, you're right.
So that you're saying the end effector does do rotate?
Yeah. So like that yellow one over here, it kind of rotated it like this. The only, I think, constraint that we have is we don't want to do like repicking. So like if something is kind of like opposite in like a really awkward way where it's not really reachable, we don't really consider that as much. We're kind of assuming that it's able to just be picked up once and then placed in whatever kind of orientation that we care about. Yeah.
So technically you could have just, like for the 8 objects one, you could have just started with everything like in a vertical way, like instead of.
That's true. Yeah, you're right. Yes, we could have, as long as it's reachable, which I think it is. Yes. I think you had a question.
So you're learning how to like you have like a target structure that you're trying to build with those specific 8 objects.
Yes.
So like that's your training, I guess. It's like, yeah, I was wondering how you know that the structure you built was optimal, but that's because you have like a target assignment.
Yeah, exactly. In the top right, we have like an image for like what we're trying to build, and yeah, the input to the model is just the environment and the target image that it gets. Yeah.
So, okay, so if you told your model to build a different target assignment, I guess it wouldn't perform well because it's not trained on that target assignment.
No, it would be able to do it. For the one thing about this work is like it's fairly robust and to like different objects that it has never seen before, and that comes down to the fact that you're doing the kind of concept breakdown of the structure. We actually trained on structures that were just like maybe 2 levels in size, and we were able to generalize as high as like structures that are like 5 or 4 levels, and that works fairly well. Another thing that we didn't have in our training data is something that I didn't even think of is like just the way that I was doing the data, but let's say you have like 2 objects, you have like 1 object here, and then I think the way that we're doing the data generation is the layers are fairly discrete, so you can't have something from layer 3 go down to layer 1. It can only rest on something that's on layer 2, and even if we make those structures in real, it's able to build those fairly well.
Did you mention what kind of like architecture you're using? I assume you're doing link predictions. I assume like some type of graph neural network.
It's a graph neural network.
Okay.
Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I think we're pretty close to time. So, all right, maybe we thank the speaker one more time.
Thank you, guys.